I was 31 years old when this happened, and I lived alone in a single-story house in rural Minnesota, in a very remote area with only a few scattered houses and lots of secondary roads around. I worked from home at the time, so I could go entire days without seeing anyone except the grocery store staff once or twice a week. It was winter, and winter there is no joke. That week, the news had already been warning about a strong, possibly historic snowstorm, but that kind of alert is common there, so I didn't take it too seriously at first. Still, I stocked up the pantry, checked the heater, and got the car ready in case the power went out. I went to bed listening to the wind start to hit the walls, that constant sound that seems like it never stops. The house creaked lightly, something normal when the temperature drops fast. I didn't hear anything else during the night and slept deeply, thinking I'd wake up to a lot of snow outside. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the silence was strange. I couldn't hear wind, cars, or anything at all. I looked out the living room window and saw that the snowstorm had covered everything. The road in front of the house was practically erased, just a continuous white field. I went to the front door to check if the snow had blocked the exit, and that's when I saw the footprints. They came from the road, crossed the yard, and went straight to my door. They were deep, well-defined footprints like someone wearing heavy boots. What froze me was realizing there were no footprints going back. They simply stopped there, right in front of the door, as if the person had arrived and disappeared. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand it. The storm had been strong all night. If someone had come and gone, there would be marks both ways. While I was still trying to find an explanation, the doorbell rang once. A single, short, dry ring. When I opened the door, there was no one outside, just snow, and the footprints were still there, intact. I closed the door slowly and stood there leaning against it for a few seconds, listening to my own heart pounding. I looked through the door viewer, then through the side windows, but I didn't see any movement. Visibility was still poor, but I could see the entire yard. There was no one there. I grabbed my phone to check for signal, and there was some, weak but working. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That someone rang the doorbell and vanished into the snow? I tried to convince myself that someone might have come to ask for help and gone back quickly, but that didn't explain the lack of outgoing footprints. I spent the morning walking around the house, checking doors and windows, trying to keep a routine. I made coffee, turned on the TV to the local news, and listened to reports about closed roads and people stuck at home. At no point did they mention anyone walking on foot in that region. The cold seemed to seep in through the corners of the house, even with the heater on. I kept looking out the window several times, expecting to see new marks, but nothing changed for a few hours. Around noon, I noticed new footprints appearing in the side yard near the kitchen window. They didn't come from the road this time. They simply appeared there, close to the wall of the house, and followed until they stopped right below the window. I watched for several minutes, trying to see if the snow was shifting, if it was some effect of the wind, but it made no sense. The marks were too clear, too recent. Later, others appeared near the bedroom window, then near the living room. Always close to the walls, always stopping right below the glass. No set of footprints connected to another. It was as if someone were circling the house from different points, never crossing the entire yard. I started keeping all the lights on and avoided getting close to the windows. The day passed slowly and heavily, with that constant feeling of being watched, even without seeing anyone. When it started to get dark, the wind returned with force, lifting loose snow and erasing part of the marks, but not all of them. Some were still visible, pressed too firmly into the ground to disappear easily. When night fully fell, the house felt smaller. The sound of the wind returned, hitting the walls and the roof, but now it only made everything more tense. I turned off some interior lights and left only the essentials on, trying not to expose myself too much through the windows. That's when I heard something outside near the front door. It wasn't a loud knock or a kick. It was the dry sound of someone stepping on snow very close to the threshold. I stood still in the hallway, not moving, listening carefully. Then I heard the doorknob being touched. It didn't turn all at once. It was a slow, careful movement, as if whoever was outside were testing it, feeling the weight of the lock. The metallic sound of a thick glove against the metal burned itself into my memory. I couldn't bring myself to approach the door. I stood there, frozen, holding my phone in a sweaty hand, trying to decide whether to call someone or not. The movement on the doorknob stopped for a few seconds, far too long. I thought it was over until I heard it again, this time a little firmer. The door didn't open, but the intent was clear. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't hear knocking asking to be let in. Just that controlled turn, as if the person knew exactly what they were doing. After that, it stopped completely. I didn't hear footsteps moving away. I didn't hear anything at all. I waited a long time before finding the courage to look through the door viewer. Outside, there was only darkness and snow being carried by the wind. No silhouette, no movement. I went back to the bedroom and pushed a light piece of furniture against the door, even knowing it wouldn't help much. I slept poorly, waking at every creak of the house with the constant feeling that someone was standing outside, waiting for something. I woke up again in the early hours of the morning, not knowing exactly what had woken me. The house was silent again, that oppressive kind of silence that only happens after heavy snow and wind. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to hear anything out of the ordinary. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to get up and go to the bedroom window, keeping the lights off. I pulled the curtain back just a little and used the faint light of my phone to look outside. That's when I saw the new footprints. They were right below the bedroom window, closer than all the others had been during the day. I could clearly see the shape of the boots and the position of someone who had been standing there, facing into the house. There were no marks leading away. None. The wind hadn't erased those yet, and that gave me certainty they had appeared after the attempt at the door. I felt a chill in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. The idea of someone standing there in the dark, silently, looking inside while I tried to sleep, put me completely on edge. When daylight finally began to break, the wind picked up again and the loose snow started to cover everything. Little by little, the footprints disappeared, erased as if they had never existed. I watched until nothing remained but white. When I felt a bit safer, I walked around the inside of the house, checking each window. It was only in the bedroom that I noticed what the wind hadn't taken away. There were handprints on the outside of the glass, right at the height where someone would have leaned their body weight to look inside. They weren't smeared, as if they had slipped. They were firm, open prints, as if someone had stood there for far too long. No other window had this, only the bedroom. I called the police as soon as I could explain the basics, but when they arrived hours later, there were no footprints anymore, no visible marks outside, just clean glass, snow, and silence. They took notes, looked around, and left. After the police were gone, the house became far too quiet again. There was no break-in, no clear threat, and that seemed to push everything into a strange place, as if nothing had really happened. Even so, I couldn't relax. I spent the rest of the day walking around the house, keeping my distance from the windows, avoiding looking outside for too long. The snowstorm continued, but it wasn't as strong as before. The isolation was total. No cars passed. No neighbors appeared. I tried to work a bit to distract my mind, but I couldn't focus. The image of the handprints on the glass kept coming back, especially the detail that they were only on the bedroom window. That wasn't random. It was where I had been sleeping. That made everything far too personal. When it got dark again, I turned on all the interior lights and left the TV on just to break the silence. Even so, every creak of the house made me look toward the door or the windows. That second night, nothing happened. No doorbell, no doorknob moving, no sound outside beyond the wind. Still, I barely slept. I stayed on the living room couch with a blanket and my phone charging, waiting for morning. When it finally got light, the storm had completely passed. The sky was clear and the cold was biting. I went outside for the first time since it happened and saw nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no marks, no sign that anyone had been there. It was as if everything had been erased along with the storm. Even so, I packed a few things into a backpack and went to a friend's house in town as soon as the roads opened. I didn't explain everything. I just said I'd had a rough night because of the storm. I stayed away for a few days trying to convince myself that it had all been just a series of bad coincidences, amplified by isolation and fear. The storm had been real, the isolation too, and the mind does strange things when it's alone for too long. Even so, at night at my friend's house, I woke easily. Any noise put me on alert. What bothered me most wasn't imagining someone trying to break in, but the way everything had happened without hurry. Nothing about it felt improvised. The footprints weren't chaotic, the doorknob test wasn't aggressive, and the handprints on the glass looked like they'd been made by someone who had enough time to stand there. That didn't fit someone lost or desperate because of the storm. It fit someone who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. When I returned to my house a few days later, everything looked too normal. The snow had been partially cleared, the yard was clean, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened there. I went in slowly as if I were visiting someone else's house. The silence returned to what it had been before the storm, that normal, rural silence. I walked through each room, touched the windows, checked the locks. Nothing out of place. Even so, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom that night. I stayed on the couch far from the windows with the constant feeling that the space had been observed too closely. It wasn't immediate fear. It was discomfort, as if something had learned the house's routine. In the days that followed, I began to notice small things I'd ignored before. Light marks in the snow after cold nights that could easily have been caused by the wind, but now caught my attention. Shadows that seemed too long when a car's headlights passed on the road. Sometimes I had the impression that someone had stood near the fence and then left, but there was never clear proof. That was almost worse because I had nothing concrete to react to. You can't call the police over a feeling. Winter went on, other snowstorms came, but none like that one. Still, every time the forecast announced a strong storm, my body reacted before my mind did. What marked me most was realizing that during that first night, the house was never truly forced. The door wasn't kicked in, the window wasn't broken. Someone tried to enter in the simplest way possible, and when they couldn't, they stood and watched. That completely changed how I saw what had happened. It didn't feel like a desperate attempt for shelter. It felt like curiosity. It felt like someone trying to understand who was inside. And when I think about that, the doorbell ringing just once makes even less sense. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. A few months later, I spoke with a more distant neighbor, someone who had lived there for many years. I didn't tell everything, just mentioned the footprints in the snowstorm. He stayed quiet for a while and said that in very harsh winters, it wasn't uncommon for people to appear where they shouldn't. He didn't explain who or how. He just commented that the wind often erases tracks, but it doesn't always erase intent. That stuck with me. It wasn't an explanation, but it also wasn't a dismissal of what I experienced. It was as if it were part of a kind of knowledge people there don't put into words. Today I still live in the same house, but some things have changed. I installed cameras, replaced the locks, and keep the exterior lights on at night. Even so, when a heavy snowstorm hits and the world becomes too silent, I avoid looking out the windows. Not because I expect to see someone there, but because I know that on that early morning, someone was close enough to leave handprints on my bedroom window. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't disappear with the wind. Story 2. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I worked at a small hospital in northern Wisconsin. I worked long shifts, and that week a strong snowstorm had taken over the region, the kind that leaves everything too white and too quiet. I left work late at night, exhausted, with a heavy head, knowing the drive home would be slow. The state highway I used was known for being poorly lit, and for passing through very open stretches with no trees, where the wind piled up snow quickly. Even so, I had driven there in bad conditions before. Before leaving the parking lot, I cleared the windshield, turned the heater on full blast, and sent a message letting someone know I was heading home. Visibility was terrible, almost zero in some spots, and I drove well below the speed limit, focused only on the lane lines that appeared and disappeared under the snow. The radio only broadcast weather alerts, repeating advice to avoid unnecessary travel. There was no one else on the road at that hour, at least no one I could see. After a few miles, I saw a flashing light ahead, faint through the snow but steady. As I got closer, I realized it was a car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights on. I slowed down even more, trying to see if anyone was outside or if there were signs of an accident. I didn't see anyone. The car was off, snow piled along its sides, as if it had been there for a while. I thought about stopping to help, but the wind was too strong and visibility too poor to safely get out of the car. I passed slowly, keeping my distance, and as soon as I went by, I checked the rearview mirror. That's when I saw the car's lights turn on. First the headlights, then the engine starting. It pulled off the shoulder and onto the road behind me, keeping an exact distance, not too close and not too far. I kept driving, trying not to take my eyes off the road, but I adjusted my speed slightly to test it. I slowed down a few miles per hour. The car behind slowed down too, at the same rate. At first, I tried not to panic. I thought it could be a coincidence, someone being as cautious as I was in that storm. I increased my speed a little, very gradually, just to see. The car behind sped up with me. I slowed down again, almost to the point of feeling my car start to slide. It did the same. It didn't tailgate, didn't try to pass, just copied every adjustment, as if using me as a reference to get through that absolute whiteout. I checked the rearview mirror several times, trying to identify the model, color, any detail, but the snow swallowed everything. All I could see were the diffused headlights, and the hazard lights were off now, as if they were no longer needed. My body tensed, hands sweaty on the steering wheel, breath short. I turned on my own hazard lights for a few seconds and then turned them off. The car behind didn't turn theirs on. That gave me a strange sense of relief, as if I still had some control. But when I slowed down again and it matched me exactly, the fear came back full force. After a few minutes of this, I saw the sign for an isolated gas station ahead, one of those that stays open 24 hours more out of stubbornness than traffic. I decided to pull in. I signaled early, turned slowly to avoid skidding, and pulled under the canopy. The station was brightly lit compared to the road, and that gave me an immediate sense of safety. I parked near the door and watched through the rearview mirror. The car behind slowed with me, crossed the station entrance, and stopped on the other side of the road, lined up with my position. Then something happened that made me go cold. All of its lights turned off at the same time. Headlights, interior light, everything. It became just a dark block in the middle of the snowstorm. I got out of my car quickly and went into the station, feeling the heat hit my face. The attendant, an older man, looked confused when I asked if he had seen that car arrive. He frowned and said he hadn't seen anyone come in or pass by. When we looked out the window, the street was empty, just snow swirling. The tire tracks ended exactly at the station entrance. Inside the station, my legs were still shaking. The attendant asked me to calmly repeat what had happened, and as I spoke, I could hear how strange it sounded myself. A car stopped on the shoulder, following me through a blizzard, stopping across the street and then simply going dark. He kept saying he hadn't seen any vehicle besides mine all night, that traffic was practically zero because of the weather. I asked him to step outside with me to look again, even knowing there was nothing there anymore. Outside, the wind had picked up and snow spun in circles under the station lights. The road looked too clean in that short stretch, as if no one had passed through except me. I looked several times at the spot where the car had stopped, expecting to see at least a shadow, but there was nothing. That gave me a strange sense of closure, as if something had ended right there. I stayed at the station for almost half an hour, trying to decide what to do. I called a friend and explained the situation briefly, and he insisted I wait for the storm to ease before continuing. The attendant agreed and said I could stay as long as I needed. While I waited, I looked out the window many times, always with the feeling that if I blinked, something would reappear across the street. Nothing did. When I finally decided to leave, I drove with extra caution, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see headlights behind me at any point. Even so, the entire drive was tense, as if the road were longer than usual. I only relaxed a little when I got home and closed the door behind me, feeling the familiar quiet of the countryside. After that night, I tried to rationalize what had happened in every possible way. I thought maybe the attendant had been distracted. Maybe the car had turned onto a side road hidden by the snow. Maybe I was just too tired after my shift. Even so, nothing explained the tire tracks ending exactly at the station entrance with no continuation. There was no other exit there, just the road I had come from. In the following days, I went back to work and heard comments about the storm, accidents, cars abandoned on the shoulder. No one mentioned anything like what I experienced. That made me even more uneasy, because there was no external context to fit that experience into. It was as if it had happened outside the normal flow of things. I started avoiding driving at night during storms, swapping shifts whenever I could. It wasn't fear of skidding. It was fear of encountering again something that didn't need visibility to follow me. A few weeks later, I drove through the same stretch during the day with clear skies and dry roads. I wanted to prove to myself it was just an ordinary place. I drove slowly, watching everything carefully. I didn't see strange marks, hidden entrances, or anything that explained what had happened. The station looked smaller in daylight, almost insignificant. Even so, when I passed the shoulder where the car had been parked that night, I felt the same tightness in my chest. There was no sign anyone had stopped there recently, but my body reacted the same way. That's when I realized that what scared me most wasn't being followed. It was the fact that someone, or something, had been able to match every one of my movements in the middle of a total whiteout, without error, without hesitation, and then simply disappear when it no longer needed to continue. Over time, I noticed that experience had changed small habits of mine without me realizing it. I started paying too much attention to my mirrors, even in normal conditions. Any car behind me for more than a few minutes made me uncomfortable. At night, especially with snow or fog, I drove as if I were always being watched, carefully adjusting speed, avoiding unnecessary stops. I didn't tell the full story to almost anyone, because there was no clear point where things had gone wrong. There was no aggressive pursuit, no direct threat, just that perfect silent imitation in the middle of a storm where you could barely see your own hood. That was what stayed with me. Whoever was behind me didn't need to see better than I did. They just needed to follow me. A few months later, during another, smaller snowstorm, I went through something that brought it all back. A car appeared behind me for a few minutes, keeping a steady distance. My body reacted instantly. I slowed slightly, waiting to see if it would do the same. It didn't. It kept going normally and then turned onto a side road. That was enough to show me that what happened that first night hadn't been a simple reflex on my part. I knew how to tell coincidence from pattern now, and the pattern from that specific night was far too clear. It wasn't someone trying to get home. It was someone choosing to accompany me until the exact moment I wouldn't be alone anymore. After that, I stopped trying to find a neat explanation. I didn't look for similar reports, didn't call the police, didn't bring it up again at the hospital. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that it didn't fit any normal road or weather situation. It wasn't someone asking for help. It wasn't someone lost. If it were, they would have reacted when I stopped at the station, kept some lights on, done anything that indicated normal human presence. Instead, the car simply shut everything off and ceased to exist the moment I wasn't alone anymore. That always comes back to me as the most important point. There was no confrontation, no mistake, just an ending that was far too clean. Today, when I drive in winter, especially at night, I avoid isolated state highways during snowstorms as much as possible. If visibility is bad, I wait. If I see a car stopped on the shoulder with hazard lights on, I slow down and observe, but I don't stop. Not out of lack of empathy, but because I learned that not every situation on the road is what it seems. Sometimes the danger isn't someone asking for help. It's someone waiting to see who will keep going. That night in the absolute white of northern Wisconsin, I had the very clear feeling that I was being used as a reference, as a guide. And when I was no longer needed, I was discarded. That's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in a police report but stays with you forever. Story 3. I was 36 years old at the time, and I spent that winter with my wife in a vacation house her family owned in the mountains of Colorado. It was a simple single-story place, used mostly in the summer, but it could handle the cold with a fireplace and electric heaters. Staying there during the winter was our idea, more for isolation than for saving money. I worked remotely, she was on leave, and we wanted some time away from people, noise, and routine. The house was isolated, on a dirt road that almost no one used in winter. There were no nearby neighbors, just forest, uneven terrain, and silence. That particular week, a prolonged snowstorm had settled over the region. It wasn't one of those quick storms. It had been snowing nonstop for 2 days, with strong wind and poor visibility. The road was already nearly unusable, and we knew leaving wouldn't be simple until the weather improved. Even so, we were calm. We had food, power, and weak cell service. That night, the storm was at its worst. The wind slammed into the walls and snow piled up against the windows, forming strange shadows, when the interior lights hit it. The fireplace was lit, and the house had that dry smell of burning wood. It was already past 10 when we heard the knock at the front door. It wasn't violent or desperate, just two firm, spaced knocks. My wife and I looked at each other immediately, because it made no sense for someone to be there at that hour in that weather. I went to the door slowly and looked through the peephole. A man was standing outside. He wore a dark coat, heavy boots, and no hood, even with the snow coming down hard. His face was visible, far too calm. When I opened the door just enough to speak, he asked for hot water, for his hands. He said it directly without explaining anything else. What caught my attention immediately was that he wasn't shaking, didn't look wet, and showed no urgency at all to get out of the cold. I told him I could bring water, but that he wouldn't come inside. I didn't say it aggressively, just firmly. He nodded as if he had expected that answer and took a light step back, staying out of the door's reach. I closed the door and went to the kitchen to get a mug. While the water heated, my wife stood beside me in silence, listening to the storm and that strange interval of no human sound outside. When I came back and opened the door again, he was in the same place, in the same posture. I handed him the mug carefully without crossing the threshold. He held it with both gloved hands and thanked me in a low voice. What unsettled me was realizing that, even with the hot mug, he didn't react. He didn't sigh, didn't comment, didn't make that automatic motion of someone trying to warm their fingers. He just held it and stood there for a few seconds, looking into the house. Not exactly at me, but past me, as if he were paying attention to something inside. After that, he took another step back and said he didn't need anything else. He turned sideways and started walking, circling the house along the side toward the yard. He didn't follow the road, didn't leave by the logical path. He simply disappeared from my view as he rounded the corner of the wall. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, expecting to hear footsteps fading in the snow, but I heard nothing but the wind. I closed and locked the door. My wife asked if he had left, and I said yes, though I wasn't sure at all. It felt like something wasn't finished. I waited a few minutes and went to the side window to look, but I didn't see anyone. No silhouette, no moving shadow, just falling snow, and the faint reflection of the living room light on the glass. A few minutes later, something made us both stand up at the same time. It wasn't a specific sound, it was that feeling that the silence had changed. I grabbed a flashlight, and we went to the living room window that faced the side of the house. The snow was still coming down hard, but the wind had eased a bit. That's when we saw the marks. Fresh boot prints, large, well-defined, lined up beneath the window, parallel to the wall. They weren't marks of someone passing by. They were marks of someone standing there, feet planted as if listening. We followed with the flashlight to the next window and saw the same thing. Beneath each window were identical marks, always stationary, always very close to the house. There was no trail connecting them. It was as if the man had appeared at each spot separately. My stomach dropped when I realized one of the windows was the bedroom window. The idea of someone standing there in the dark, listening to us talk, gave me a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I ran back to the front door and opened it just a crack to look into the yard. There were no tracks leading away, neither along the side nor out front. The footprints simply ended there, as if he had stayed long enough and then stopped being there. The mug of hot water was nowhere to be found, not dropped, not left in the snow. I closed and locked the door again, this time checking it twice. My wife was pale, hugging herself, and asked if he could come back. I said I didn't know, and that was the worst part. There had been no urgency, no real request for help. Everything had been too calm, too controlled. We spent the rest of the night awake, lights on, listening to the wind and waiting for a sound that never came. Morning took longer than usual to arrive that day. The storm didn't begin to ease until hours later, and gray light slowly filtered through the windows, revealing snow piled nearly halfway up the walls. When we finally had the courage to go outside, we went straight to check around the house. The footprints were still there, clear and exactly where we had seen them the night before. None showed any movement away. There were no tracks leading to the road, no marks heading off into the woods. It was as if the man had simply ceased to exist there. We circled the house carefully, checking every corner. We didn't find the mug, any signs of a struggle or anything that explained how someone could have moved that way without leaving a trail. The most disturbing thing was the regularity of the marks, always positioned facing the windows as if the focus had never been the door, but the inside of the house. For the rest of the day we tried to act normally, but nothing felt normal. Any sound outside made us stop and listen. When the snow finally stopped completely, the silence became even more noticeable. There were no signs of cars, people, or life around us. The road was still blocked, and we knew we'd be there at least one more night. Before dark, we drew the curtains, reinforced the locks, and left lights on in every room. We didn't talk much about what had happened because there was no conclusion to reach. What bothered me most was remembering the man's expression. He didn't look cold, tired, or relieved when holding the hot water. He just seemed attentive, like someone who came to confirm something and left once he had. On the second night, no one knocked on the door. Still, we slept little. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the house made us look at each other in silence. More than once, I had the clear sensation that someone was outside, standing there even without hearing anything. It wasn't immediate fear, it was discomfort, as if the space around the house had been occupied before and was now too empty. I kept thinking about his request, specifically the choice of words. Hot water for the hands. He didn't ask for shelter, food, or to use the phone. Just that. And even so, he didn't seem to truly need it. It felt more like a pretext to get to the door and observe who was inside. When the road was finally cleared 2 days later, we packed up and left without hesitation. We didn't mention anything to anyone in the area. We didn't call the police or file any report. There was no crime, no direct threat, just something far too wrong to explain. On the way down the mountain, I checked the rear-view mirror several times, expecting to see someone standing by the roadside, but I saw nothing. Even so, the feeling wasn't relief, it was closure, as if that visit had been enough. We never returned to that house in the winter. The following summer, when the family used it again, nothing strange was reported. No footprints, no visitors, nothing out of the ordinary. Today, when I think about that night, what bothers me most aren't the marks in the snow. It's the certainty that the man wasn't improvising anything. He knew where he was, knew there were people inside, and knew he didn't need to enter to get what he wanted. The footprints beneath the windows made that clear. He listened to us talk, move, exist inside that house, and then he left without haste, without a trail, taking the mug with him. Since then, whenever someone knocks on my door under circumstances that don't make sense, I stop and think before answering. Because that night in the middle of a snowstorm in the mountains of Colorado, it became clear to me that not every request for help is about help. Story 4. I was 22 years old when this happened, and I was studying at a small university in northern Illinois. I lived off campus in a simple apartment and depended on the city bus to get home at night. It wasn't the most reliable system in the world, but it usually worked. That day, a heavy snowstorm began in the late afternoon and got worse as the night went on. Evening classes weren't canceled, so I stayed late at the library finishing an assignment. When I left, it was already past 10:30 at night. The wind was strong, the snow was falling sideways, and the streets were practically empty. I knew that was the last bus of the night and that if I missed it, I'd have to walk more than half an hour home. Even so, I went to the stop, thinking it would still come. The bus stop was on a wide avenue, near an empty parking lot and a closed commercial building. There was no shelter, just a metal sign and a bench covered in snow. The lighting came from a streetlight that flickered now and then, making everything feel even stranger. The ground was covered in a soft layer of fresh snow, with very few marks besides my own. I stood there with my hood pulled up, looking at the empty road and checking the time on my phone, which still showed the bus as on the way. The silence was broken only by the wind and the distant sound of something loose banging somewhere. I was starting to think about giving up when I heard footsteps approaching along the sidewalk behind me. When I turned around, I saw a man walking toward me. He looked to be about my age, maybe a little older, but it was hard to tell because of the heavy coat and the beanie pulled down almost to his eyes. He didn't seem rushed or bothered by the snow. He walked at a steady pace, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. He stopped a few steps away from me near the bench at the stop. and stood there looking at the road with me for a few seconds without saying anything. That alone was strange, because no one waited at that stop at that hour when the weather turned like that. After that brief silence, he spoke in a far too calm tone. "The bus doesn't run when it snows like this." It wasn't a complaint or a concerned warning. It sounded more like a statement of fact, like someone saying something obvious. I replied that the app still showed it coming, but he didn't react or argue. He just gave a half smile that I could barely see, and took a few steps to the side, moving a little farther away. He stopped about 4 or 5 meters from me, closer to the street, and stood there staring at the empty road. He didn't check his phone, didn't look around, didn't show impatience. He just stared at the dark stretch where the bus should appear. That started to make me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. I looked back at my phone, which now showed an indefinite delay. The wind picked up and the snow began to pile up faster on the ground. That's when I noticed something that didn't make sense. His footprints weren't there. Mine were clearly visible, marked from where I had stopped to the bench. His simply didn't exist. I looked around, trying to find some trace I might have missed, but there was nothing connecting where he had come from to where he was standing now. The ground around his feet was smooth, untouched, as if no one had stepped there. I felt an immediate chill run up my spine, the kind that hits before it even becomes a thought. I looked again at his feet, then at the snow around them, trying to find a simple explanation. I thought maybe the wind had erased the tracks, but that didn't make sense. Mine were still there, well defined, and the snow was falling evenly. There hadn't been a strong enough gust to erase only his footprints. I stood there for a few seconds watching, trying not to stare too much because the situation was already far too strange for my liking. He remained motionless, looking at the road, as if he were waiting for something specific to appear. He didn't seem lost, irritated, or cold. That gave me a bad feeling, like I was the only one there who hadn't understood something obvious yet. I decided I wasn't going to wait for the bus anymore. I put my phone in my pocket and started walking down the sidewalk toward home without saying anything. I took a few steps and stopped on instinct, glancing back out of the corner of my eye. The man was still in the same place, in the same position, looking at the road. I kept walking, now a little faster, feeling the snow sink under my feet. After a few meters, I decided to cross the street to take an alternative route that was more brightly lit. I looked both ways, crossed carefully, and kept going. That's when I realized something was wrong again. The man was on the other side of the street, farther ahead, standing on the sidewalk, waiting for me. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen him cross. He was just there, a few meters ahead, looking in my direction for the first time. My whole body froze. It wasn't a sudden jolt of fear. It was that cold kind that makes everything slow down. I stood there staring at him, trying to understand how that had happened. The street wasn't wide, but it was open enough that I should have seen someone cross even with the snow. I hadn't heard a step, seen a shadow move. Nothing. He didn't look out of breath or rushed. He was in the same posture as before, hands in his pockets, body relaxed as if he had always been there. The difference was that now he was looking directly at me. There was no hostility in his face, but there was no curiosity either. It was an overly neutral look, like someone watching something predictable unfold. My mouth went dry and I clenched my fists inside my coat, trying to decide whether to turn back, change routes, or say something. Without saying anything, I turned right and started walking faster, almost jogging, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't run immediately because I didn't want to draw attention, even though I wasn't sure from whom. After a few seconds, I looked back by reflex. He was no longer where he had appeared. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, thinking it was over. But that relief didn't last long. A few meters ahead, near a poorly lit corner, I saw his silhouette again, standing exactly where I would have to pass. It made no sense at all. There was no shorter path, no way he could have passed me without me noticing, and yet he was there again, waiting as if he knew which route I would choose. I stopped completely, snow slipping into my coat collar, trying to control my breathing. I thought about crossing the street again, but the idea of turning my back on him made me immediately uneasy. I glanced quickly at the ground, almost reflexively, and confirmed what I already suspected. His footprints still weren't there. None. The snow around his feet remained smooth, soft, untouched, while mine left a clear trail behind me. That erased any doubt I still had that something was very wrong. He remained standing there, not approaching, not speaking, just occupying the space exactly where I needed to pass. The wind seemed to die down, and for a moment everything became too quiet, as if the entire city were suspended in that scene. Without thinking much, I changed strategy. I turned my back completely and started walking fast in the opposite direction, almost running now, slipping a bit in the snow. I didn't hear anything behind me, no footsteps, no sound of someone following me. That was worse than hearing something. After a few seconds, I worked up the courage to look over my shoulder. The man was gone. The stretch of street was empty, just the flickering street light and falling snow. I kept walking without slowing, trying to reach a busier area. That's when I saw, reflected in the glass of a closed shop ahead, his silhouette standing behind me on the other side of the street, staring fixedly, as if he had always been there. My body went into automatic mode at that point. I stopped trying to understand and focused only on getting out of there as fast as possible. I crossed the street without really checking for traffic and headed toward an older neighborhood, where I knew some houses were still occupied. There weren't many lights on, but just seeing them made me feel a little less exposed. I looked back several times while walking fast, almost running, and didn't see the man again. No silhouette, no strange movement. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was as if he didn't need to be visible anymore to remain present. When I finally reached a busier street with an open bar and a few parked cars, I stopped and tried to pull myself together. I stood there for a few minutes, breathing deeply, until my legs stopped trembling. I got home much later than usual, clothes soaked with snow and my mind racing. I locked the door, checked the windows, and stood in the middle of the living room for a while, listening to the silence of the apartment. That night, the bus really didn't come. The next day, I learned that service had been suspended after that time because of the snowstorm. That only reinforced one thing that never left my mind. He knew. He knew before I did that I'd be stuck there waiting for something that wasn't coming. Since then, I've avoided that bus stop, even on normal days. I take longer routes, catch different lines, do anything to avoid standing there alone at night. Because that snowstorm on a nearly empty street in northern Illinois made one thing clear to me. That man wasn't waiting for the bus. He was waiting for someone. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if it had just been a scare caused by exhaustion and the weather. I mentioned to a few classmates that I'd missed the last bus because of the storm, but I didn't go into details. No one found it strange because there really were a lot of delays that night. Still, every time I thought about the man, what bothered me most wasn't the way he appeared ahead of me. It was the way he seemed to know exactly when I would give up waiting. He didn't physically stop me, didn't say anything after that first sentence. He just occupied the right space at the right time, as if that were enough to guide me where I was already going. A few weeks later, I passed the same bus stop during the day. Everything was normal. People coming and going, cars passing, old snow marks already melted. I stood there for a few seconds, calmly observing the place. There was nothing special, nothing that explained what had happened. Even so, I felt that same tightness in my stomach, as if the place itself had retained something. I looked at the sidewalk, remembering the smooth snow beneath his feet, without marks, without a trail. I thought about how, that night, I had been the only one leaving proof that I was there. And that made me realize that if I had kept waiting for the bus, I might still be at that stop, standing there staring at the empty road with him. Today, whenever it snows heavily and transportation is delayed, I leave before I'm alone waiting, no matter how inconvenient it is. I'd rather walk, ask for a ride, or completely change my route. It's not irrational fear. It's bodily memory. That night taught me that not every warning comes as a threat. Sometimes it comes as simple information said too early, by someone who shouldn't know. And when I think of that man standing there looking at the road as if he already knew nothing would come from it, the only certainty that remains is that I wasn't just a student waiting for a bus. I was part of something that had already been decided before I got there. Story 5. I was 29 years old when this happened, and I lived alone in an old 3-story building in Michigan, in a mid-sized city where winters are usually harsh. The building dated back to the 1940s, with narrow hallways, wooden stairs that creaked, and walls that were far too thin. I lived on the second floor, in a small but comfortable apartment, and had been there for almost 2 years. I'd never had any serious problems, just the normal noises of an old building: footsteps, pipes popping, doors slamming in the wind. That week, a heavy snowstorm hit the city and knocked out power in several blocks, including mine. When the lights went out, it was already night. I lit a few candles, grabbed some blankets, and accepted that it would be one of those long, cold nights. The electric heater obviously didn't work without power, so the apartment started cooling down quickly. Outside, the wind howled between the buildings, and the silence between gusts felt far too strange. After a while, sitting on the couch with my coat still on, I began to feel a light warmth. At first, I thought it was just my body adjusting or the effect of the blankets. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the heater turning on. It wasn't loud, but it was that sharp click followed by the sound of air being pushed. I stood up immediately, my heart racing, and went into the apartment hallway. The heater was on. The air coming out was genuinely warm. I stood there trying to understand how that was possible without electricity. I looked at the control panel, touched the knob, and turned it off. It shut off. A few seconds later, it turned itself back on, ran for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then shut off again. The silence that followed felt heavy, and I had a clear sense that I was no longer alone in that space, even though I couldn't see anyone. Right after that, I heard footsteps in the building hallway. They weren't running or hurried, they were slow, spaced out, like someone walking without any urgency. The sound came from outside my apartment in the shared hallway, and echoed with that hollow quality typical of old buildings. I assumed a neighbor was checking on the power situation, so I opened my door just a little and looked out. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint emergency light near the stairwell. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps continued for a few more seconds and then stopped right in front of my door. I waited to hear a knock, someone calling out, anything. Nothing happened. I worked up the courage and opened the door a bit more, looking both ways. The hallway was empty. No shadow moving away, no door closing. I went to the door of the neighbor across the hall and knocked, asking if everything was okay. No one answered. I knocked on 2 more doors on the floor with the same result. Everything was far too quiet, as if the building were completely empty. I went back inside with a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I locked the door and stood in the living room, listening. The heater didn't turn on again, but the air still felt warmer than it should have. A little later, I heard footsteps again, this time farther away, as if they were coming from the stairwell. I went into the kitchen and placed my hand on the wall. It was warm. Not hot like with the heating on, but definitely not cold as it should have been on a powerless night in the middle of a snowstorm. That left me confused and nervous at the same time. None of it made sense. I grabbed my phone and tried calling the building manager, but there was no signal at that moment. I sat on the couch with my phone in hand, waiting for any sound that might explain what was happening. But the building fell silent again. After a while, the silence grew so intense that I began to notice things that usually go unnoticed. The crack of wood cooling, the wind rattling a poorly sealed window, the distant sound of snow being pushed along the street. I avoided walking around much, as if the sound of my own footsteps might draw attention. At some point, I got up to go to the bathroom and realized that the moment I walked down the apartment's internal hallway, I heard a muffled sound from above. It wasn't a clear step, but it was too heavy to be just the building settling. I stopped in the middle of the hallway and listened, my heart pounding. The sound didn't repeat. Still, I had the distinct feeling that something had moved exactly when I moved. When the power finally came back on, it was already past midnight. The lights came on all at once, and the distant noise of the city returned. The heater didn't turn on by itself this time. Everything seemed almost too normal, as if nothing had happened. Even so, I called the building manager the next morning and told him what had occurred, especially the part about the heater working without power. There was a pause on the other end of the line before he answered. He said with complete certainty that the building had no gas heaters or alternative systems. Everything was electric, old, but electric. When I mentioned the footsteps and the noise from above, he added something that made me go cold. The apartment above mine had been empty since the previous winter. No one lived there. It was locked, unfurnished, with no power connected. After that conversation, I tried to convince myself that everything had been a poorly explained coincidence. An old building, pipes, strange thermal insulation, my tired mind after a night without electricity. Still, that same night, I couldn't relax. I moved slowly around the apartment, paying attention to every sound. That's when I noticed something that made me stop in the middle of the living room. Every time I took a few steps, I heard a sharp knock coming from the ceiling. It wasn't random creaking. It was a short, controlled sound like someone knocking with a closed fist from the other side. I took 2 more steps. 2 knocks, almost in the same rhythm. I stopped. The sound didn't repeat. I stood there for a few seconds, my whole body tense, then took a short step backward. The knock came again immediately like a response. I tested this a few more times, not wanting to believe what was happening. 1 step, 1 knock, 2 steps, 2 knocks, always right after, never before. It wasn't someone walking, it was someone reacting. I felt a knot form in my stomach and went into the bedroom, trying not to make noise. When I leaned a hand against the wall to steady myself, I heard a light dragging sound above, as if something had been moved across the floor of the empty apartment. I remembered what the manager had said, that no one lived there, that it had been locked for months. Even so, the sound was too real to ignore. I locked the bedroom door and spent the rest of the night awake, sitting on the bed waiting for the next noise that only came when I moved. The next morning I woke up with pain all over my body, as if I hadn't slept at all. Daylight streaming through the windows made the apartment look almost too normal, almost safe. I made coffee, took a shower, and tried to follow my routine, but everything felt off. I avoided moving around much, almost tiptoeing, as if someone might still be reacting to every movement I made. I didn't hear any more knocks that morning, but that didn't comfort me. The absence of sound felt intentional, as if there was no longer a need to respond. Before leaving for work, I stood in the middle of the living room for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, waiting for any sign. Nothing happened. Even so, I closed the door harder than usual when I left. I spent the entire day distracted, replaying every detail of the previous night in my head. The more I thought about it, the less logic I found. If the apartment above mine was empty, there was no way someone could have reacted to my steps like that. And the heater turning on during the power outage remained the hardest thing to ignore. When I returned home late that afternoon, the building was as quiet as ever. I climbed the stairs slowly and noticed that the door to the apartment above mine was still closed. Dust collected on the frame, exactly as before. No sign of recent use. I entered my apartment cautiously and left all the lights on, as if that could make any difference. That night I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway or knocks on the ceiling. Still, I slept poorly, waking at every small noise the building made. Over the next few days, nothing unusual happened. The heater worked normally, the hallways stayed quiet, and winter continued as harsh as always. Even so, something had changed. I began to perceive the space above my apartment differently, as if it weren't truly empty, just unoccupied. I avoided making unnecessary noise, avoided walking around late at night, avoided even thinking about it too much, because every time I did, that clear feeling returned that the responses from the ceiling hadn't been random. A few weeks later, I spoke with the building manager again and asked if there were any plans to rent out the apartment upstairs. He said no, that the previous tenant had moved out the winter before and the place had been closed since then, including having the heating turned off to avoid problems. That only reinforced what I already knew. There was no one officially there. Not long after that, I decided to move. It wasn't because of one final scare or something new happening. It was because, on that snowstorm night, something responded to my footsteps from a place that shouldn't have responded at all. And even though it never made another sound, I knew it had learned how to follow me in silence. Story 6. I was 41 years old when this happened, and I worked on a farm in rural Iowa, in a very isolated area where almost everyone wakes up before the sun. I lived alone in a simple house and took the same secondary road every day to get to work. A straight road bordered by open fields, with no lighting and no houses for several miles. That night, a heavy snowstorm had come through, the kind that doesn't make much noise but covers everything all at once. I woke up while it was still dark, around 5 in the morning, with the cold seeping in through the cracks in the house. I made coffee, dressed in layers, and headed out, assuming the road would be bad but passable. It wasn't uncommon for a snowplow to go through early out there, but it didn't always happen. I turned on the truck radio, but it only picked up static and weather alerts. The world outside seemed frozen. No wind, no movement, just that continuous white reflecting the weak glow of the headlights. After a few minutes of driving slowly, I saw something blocking the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a poorly cleared pile of snow or a tractor stopped at a bad angle. As I got closer, I realized it was a snowplow truck, large, taking up almost the entire width of the road. It was turned off, with its lights out, and looked like it had stopped in the middle of a maneuver. I slowed down even more and pulled my truck to a safe distance. The snowplow's engine wasn't running. There was no exhaust vapor, nothing. That's when I saw the man sitting in the driver's seat. He was motionless, staring straight ahead, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't wearing a hat and didn't seem to be protecting himself from the cold at all. I sat there in my truck for a few seconds, trying to understand why someone would be there like that, on an empty road, right after a snowstorm. I got out of my truck slowly, leaving the engine running more out of habit than courage. The silence was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of metal cooling. The snow under my boots crunched far too loudly, making me painfully aware of every step. As I got closer, I noticed that the snowplow didn't have fresh tracks around it, as if it hadn't just arrived there. The front blade was clean with no snow buildup, which didn't match the condition of the road. I stopped a few meters from the driver's door and tried calling out to the man, asking if everything was okay. He didn't respond. He didn't move. His face was still turned forward, rigid, as if he were waiting for something to appear on the empty road ahead. It was only when I took one more step that he moved. He didn't turn his body, only his face slowly until he was looking straight at me. His eyes were open, far too alert, but with no clear expression. His mouth barely moved when he spoke, almost without sound, forcing me to lean in slightly to hear him. He whispered, "It's not safe to stop here." It wasn't hurried or concerned. It sounded more like a calm statement of fact. That sent an immediate chill through me, because it didn't address the situation at all. I asked what had happened, whether he needed help, but he didn't say anything else. He just kept looking at me, unmoving, as if the conversation had ended there. I felt a strong impulse to step back, one of those instincts that comes before thought. I took a step backward without realizing it, and glanced around, as if only then noticing how empty that road really was. There were no recent tire tracks besides my own, no sign that any other vehicle had passed since the snowstorm. Low fog was beginning to drift slowly over the fields, creeping toward the road. When I looked back at the truck, the man was still staring at me in the exact same position without blinking. His words kept echoing in my head, not like a normal warning, but like something I was meant to accept without question. I didn't respond. I just took 2 more steps back, feeling the cold cut through my clothes, and started turning toward my truck. When I got inside and shut the door, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I flipped on the high beams out of reflex, pointing them straight at the snowplow. The light cut through the fog for a few seconds, and then there was nothing there anymore. No truck, no man, no shadow. The road was completely clear, just snow-covered asphalt and white fields on both sides. I didn't hear an engine start, didn't see lights moving away, and there hadn't been enough time for a large vehicle to leave. The fog continued drifting slowly, as if it had swallowed everything. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to decide whether I'd really seen any of it, or whether exhaustion had played a disturbingly convincing trick on me. I stayed there too long, engine running, high beams aimed at a road that had been blocked moments earlier. I turned the high beams off and on again, as if that might bring something back. Nothing changed. It felt like I had arrived at a moment where something had just ended, and I'd missed the final part. I carefully turned the truck around and continued on, driving even slower than before. For several minutes, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the snowplow emerge again from the fog behind me. It never did. The rest of the drive was silent and heavy, and I arrived at the farm later than usual with a delay I couldn't really explain. I vaguely mentioned that the road had been bad, but didn't go into details. It didn't feel like something you talk about over early morning coffee. Later that day, with the sun already high, the fog was completely gone. The road looked exactly as it always did, open, unobstructed. On my way home, I stopped at the exact spot where I'd seen the truck blocking the road. I got out, looked around, searched for tire marks, anything out of place. There was nothing. No sign that a large vehicle had been there hours earlier. That bothered me more than if I'd found confusing tracks. The total absence of marks made everything feel more final, as if that encounter had never been part of the road itself, only of the moment. Even so, his words stayed clear in my mind, spoken in that unnervingly calm way. It's not safe to stop here. In the days that followed, that scene started slipping into my thoughts at random times. It wasn't direct fear, more like a constant sense of alertness. Every time I drove early in the morning with low fog or after fresh snow, my foot eased off the accelerator without me noticing. I kept thinking about the way he spoke, the exact tone, as if he wasn't referring to the blocked truck or even the road itself, but to the act of stopping, as if that specific point wasn't meant for someone to remain there very long. I asked a coworker at the farm whether any snowplow had gone through that morning. He said no, that the county usually starts with other routes and only gets to that road much later. That stuck with me because the truck I'd seen hadn't been clearing anything. It had just been there, waiting. A few days later, I decided to call the county road department, more out of curiosity than to report anything. I explained that I'd seen a snowplow stopped on a secondary road early in the morning and asked if they'd sent anyone out there that day. The woman on the other end checked quickly and said that no vehicle had been assigned to that road at any point that day, neither early nor later. She added that after snowstorms like that, people often mistake tractors or private trucks for snowplows. But I knew that wasn't it. The truck was too large, too specific, and the man behind the wheel didn't act like someone working. The conversation ended there, but I hung up knowing there was no practical explanation. After that, I never stopped on that stretch of road again for any reason. If I see something strange ahead, I slow down and keep going, even if it means taking a long detour later. It's not fear of an accident. It's respect for that warning. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that he wasn't trying to help me with the truck. He was telling me something about the place, about the moment. Stopping there, at that exact spot, at that hour, wasn't a good idea. Sometimes I wonder if, had I turned off my engine and stayed outside my truck longer trying to deal with the situation, I would have been able to leave afterward. The way everything vanished, without sound, without trace, made it clear I only saw it because I arrived at the exact moment. Not before, not after. Today, when I pass that stretch of road on foggy mornings or right after a snowfall, it looks like any other. Open fields, straight road, nothing special. Even so, my body reacts before my mind does, and I speed up without realizing it. I've never seen another truck there, or that man again, but the phrase stays sharp in my memory, spoken in that calm, almost neutral tone. Not as a threat, not as friendly advice, but as a simple fact. It's not safe to stop here. And the more time passes, the more certain I am that it wasn't a warning about the road. It was a warning about staying.
I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.